January 1945, SHAEF headquarters, Versailles. Snow fell in slow descent beyond the frost-edged windows of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force on a bitter morning, when the weight of war pressed against every wall and every mind within those stone corridors. The war room smelled of tobacco smoke and damp wool, of coffee gone cold in porcelain cups, of maps that had been handled so many times the paper threatened to split along the creases. General Dwight Eisenhower stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight with the particular tension that comes not from enemy action, but from friction among friends. Outside, the frozen gardens of Versailles lay silent under their white covering, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the palace that had once hosted kings and now harboured the machinery of liberation. The trouble had been building for months, but it reached its breaking point in the aftermath of the German offensive through the Ardennes that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Between December 16th of 1944 and late January of 1945, Hitler had gambled everything on a desperate thrust through the weakest point of the Allied line, sending 3 armies crashing through the snow-laden forests of Belgium and Luxembourg in a bid to split the American and British forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The attack caught the Americans by surprise, created a dangerous bulge in the front lines, and sent shockwaves of alarm through every command post from Paris to Washington. In response to this crisis, Eisenhower had made a practical military decision that would have profound political consequences. He temporarily placed the American 1st and 9th Armies fighting north of the Bulge under British command, specifically under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The logic was sound from a tactical standpoint. With German forces having severed communications between American units, and with Montgomery's 21st Army Group positioned immediately to the north, coordinated command made operational sense. But Montgomery, brilliant and insufferable in equal measure, saw the arrangement differently. To him, it represented vindication of his long-standing argument that the Allied campaign needed a single ground forces commander, himself, rather than Eisenhower's strategy of advancing on a broad front with multiple army groups pushing simultaneously toward Germany. Montgomery had never reconciled himself to serving under Eisenhower, though Eisenhower held the title of Supreme Commander. Montgomery considered himself the superior soldier, the proven victor of El Alamein, the methodical professional among what he viewed as enthusiastic amateurs. The British Field Marshal had pushed repeatedly for a narrow thrust strategy, a single powerful drive through the Low Countries into the industrial Ruhr and onward to Berlin, with his forces leading the way and other armies playing supporting roles. Eisenhower had consistently rejected this approach, believing it would leave Allied flanks dangerously exposed and supply lines stretched beyond sustainability. Instead, he favoured advancing along the entire front, maintaining constant pressure on German forces while keeping his armies mutually supporting. The disagreement was not merely tactical, but philosophical, touching on questions of risk, glory, national pride, and the very nature of coalition warfare. The Battle of the Bulge intensified these tensions. Montgomery took command of the northern shoulder of the salient and directed operations with his characteristic caution and precision. American forces under his temporary command, including the 1st Army, led by General Courtney Hodges, and the 9th Army under General William Simpson, fought with desperate courage in freezing conditions, holding key positions at Saint-Ouen, Vith and Bastogne, grinding down German momentum through sheer determination and sacrifice. By late December, the German offensive had exhausted itself, running out of fuel and facing reinforced Allied positions on all sides. The threat passed. The Bulge began to flatten. Then Montgomery held a press conference on January 7th, 1945. The Field Marshal's words, delivered with his usual crisp confidence, struck like grenades in the careful diplomacy of coalition warfare. He described the battle in terms that minimized American contributions and exaggerated his own intervention. He spoke of how British forces had saved the situation, how he personally had organized the defense and orchestrated the counterattack, how the Americans had needed British steadiness to prevail. The tone suggested that fumbling American commanders had created the crisis and that British military superiority had resolved it. He did not explicitly say these things. Montgomery rarely needed to be explicit, but the implications hung heavy in every sentence, every careful pause, every tone of patrician condescension. The American press exploded with fury. Newspapers across the United States ran headlines questioning Allied unity and demanding accountability. Editorials raged against British arrogance and called for American forces to operate independently. The political temperature in Washington rose to dangerous levels. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group and a man of considerable patience, threatened to resign if Montgomery received operational control over American armies. Other American commanders expressed similar sentiments in communications that grew increasingly blunt. The alliance that had stormed Normandy and liberated France now threatened to fracture over wounded pride and national honor. Eisenhower found himself in an impossible position. He commanded the largest military coalition in history, a force drawn from dozens of nations, but dominated by American and British power. His role required not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse of the highest order. He had to balance competing egos, navigate political pressures from London and Washington, maintain the confidence of subordinate commanders, and keep the focus on defeating Germany rather than on internal disputes. He had managed these tensions through months of difficult campaigning, smoothing conflicts, absorbing criticisms, making compromises, always placing coalition unity above personal feelings or national interests. But Montgomery had pushed too far. The Field Marshal continued his campaign for expanded authority even as the furor over his press conference raged. He sent a letter to Eisenhower on January 21st, putting his demands in writing with all the tact of a sledgehammer. Montgomery insisted that Eisenhower give him control of all ground operations north of the Ardennes, relegating Bradley to a secondary role. He argued that only unified command under a single ground forces commander, meaning himself, could ensure victory. He suggested that Eisenhower, as supreme commander, should focus on broad political matters and leave actual battlefield direction to professionals. The letter carried an implicit threat: accept these terms or face continued discord within the alliance. Eisenhower read the letter in his private office, away from the maps and staff officers, in a moment of solitude where he could process the full measure of what Montgomery demanded. The general from Kansas, who had risen through merit rather than social standing, who had built his career on getting along with difficult personalities and finding workable compromises, who had subordinated his own ego again and again to keep the coalition functioning, reached the end of his tolerance. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. He would not yield. He would not sacrifice American commanders who had proven their courage and competence to satisfy British pride. He would not reorganize his command structure to suit Montgomery's vanity. And if Montgomery could not accept these realities, then Montgomery could leave. Eisenhower drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff, the joint American-British command authority that oversaw the European theatre. The message was direct and devastating. Either Montgomery would cease his agitation for expanded authority and accept Eisenhower's command arrangements, or Eisenhower himself would ask to be relieved. The cable effectively forced the Allied leadership to choose between their supreme commander and a subordinate field marshal, between the architect of D-Day and a man whose tactical brilliance came wrapped in insufferable arrogance. Given the political realities, American forces now vastly outnumbered British troops in Europe, American industrial power sustained the entire campaign. American public opinion mattered enormously to continued support for the war. The choice was never really in doubt. Before sending the cable, Eisenhower showed it to his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, a man known for his own sharp edges and willingness to deliver hard truths. Smith understood immediately what Eisenhower intended. The cable would end Montgomery's campaign for greater authority and possibly end Montgomery's career in the European theatre. It represented the kind of confrontation that Eisenhower had avoided throughout the war, the moment when diplomatic patience gave way to command authority, when coalition politics yielded to military necessity. Smith supported the decision without reservation. The draft went forward. Word of the cable's existence reached British ears through various channels. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and Montgomery's strongest supporter in London, recognised the disaster looming over British military prestige. He moved quickly to contain the damage. Brooke contacted Montgomery directly, making clear that the Field Marshal's position had become untenable. The British government would not sacrifice Eisenhower to preserve Montgomery's ambitions. If Montgomery forced the issue, he would find himself recalled to London in disgrace. The choice Montgomery faced was simple: apologise and accept subordination, or leave in defeat. Montgomery, confronted with this ultimatum, discovered that his confidence had limits. He drafted a letter to Eisenhower that approximated an apology, though it retained hints of his usual tone. He assured Eisenhower of his loyalty and promised to operate within the existing command structure. The letter arrived like a surrender flag, grudging and incomplete, but sufficient to step back from the precipice. Eisenhower accepted it, not because the apology satisfied him, but because coalition unity required giving Montgomery an exit that preserved basic dignity. The crisis passed. The cable to the combined chiefs remained unsent, its mere existence having achieved the necessary result. Yet something had changed permanently in the relationship between the Supreme Commander and his most difficult subordinate. Montgomery continued to command the 21st Army Group through the remainder of the war, leading British and Canadian forces across the Rhine and into northern Germany. He performed his duties with professional competence, but he never again wielded the influence he had sought, never achieved the dominant role he believed his talents deserved. The broad front strategy continued unchanged. American armies drove toward the Elbe, while British forces secured the northern approaches. Berlin fell to Soviet forces advancing from the east. Victory came in May of 1945, achieved through the combined efforts of millions of soldiers whose nationality mattered far less than their courage and sacrifice. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery revealed fundamental truths about coalition warfare that transcended the personalities involved. Successful alliances require more than shared enemies and common objectives. They demand mutual respect, genuine partnership, willingness to subordinate national pride to collective purpose. They function only when leaders place mission accomplishment above personal glory, when professional disagreement occurs within bounds of courtesy and recognition that allies deserve consideration even in dispute. Montgomery's failing was not his strategic vision. Historians still debate whether a narrow thrust might have shortened the war, but his inability to advocate for that vision, while respecting the coalition structure and the authority of the commander appointed to lead it. Eisenhower's leadership in this crisis demonstrated qualities that would serve him well in later years when he became president. He showed patience that bent without breaking, tolerance that had clear limits, diplomatic skill combined with willingness to confront when necessary. He understood that coalition command meant managing egos and politics as much as directing armies. He recognized that sometimes the hardest decisions involve not what order to give, but when to draw lines that cannot be crossed. He proved that genuine authority comes not from titles or rank alone, but from the respect earned through consistent judgment, fairness, and willingness to take responsibility for hard choices. The broader context of the dispute revealed shifts in global power that would define the post-war world. American military and industrial dominance in 1945 foreshadowed the role the United States would play in the decades ahead. British power, though still formidable, had reached its limits. The empire that once commanded a quarter of the globe's territory now depended on American strength to sustain its position. Montgomery's struggle for authority reflected Britain's struggle to maintain influence in a world increasingly shaped by American and Soviet might. The Field Marshal's defeat in his contest with Eisenhower paralleled his nation's declining ability to dictate terms in international affairs. The soldiers who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes knew nothing of these command disputes while they endured the winter of 1944 and 1945. They cared only about survival, about the men fighting beside them, about the next objective and the next meal and the possibility of warmth. Their valor transcended nationality. American infantrymen held impossible positions against overwhelming German attacks. British tank crews probed enemy positions with methodical determination. Canadian troops cleared German resistance from shattered towns. They fought not for Montgomery's glory or Eisenhower's strategy, but for the idea that tyranny must be defeated, that freedom was worth the terrible price demanded by total war. The snow that fell on Versailles that January morning eventually melted into spring. The war in Europe ended with German surrender in early May. The troops went home, those who survived, carrying memories of cold and fear and loss. Montgomery received his Marshal's baton and his place in history books as a controversial figure of considerable ability and equally considerable difficulty. Eisenhower returned to America as the supreme hero of the European campaign, the general who had held together an unprecedented alliance and led it to victory over Nazi Germany. But the lesson of that confrontation endured beyond the particular personalities and circumstances. It spoke to the essential nature of free societies working together toward common purpose. Democracies do not naturally produce the unity of command that authoritarian systems impose through force. Democratic alliances require constant negotiation, compromise, acceptance of inefficiency and friction as the price of maintaining coalition cohesion. They succeed not through dictatorial clarity, but through the messy process of accommodation, where proud nations and strong-willed leaders find ways to work together despite profound disagreements. The strength of such alliances lies precisely in their voluntary nature. Partners choose to cooperate because they recognize that common threats require common action, that individual nations, however powerful, cannot face certain challenges alone. The weakness of such alliances lies in the difficulty of maintaining unity when national interests diverge or when personalities clash. The test comes in moments like January 1945, when the alliance could have fractured over pride and ambition, but instead held together because leaders ultimately placed shared purpose above personal desire. That cold morning at Versailles, when Eisenhower stood before his maps and contemplated forcing a choice between himself and Montgomery, represented more than a command crisis in a military campaign. It embodied the perpetual tension between authority and coalition, between the need for unified direction and the reality of democratic partnership, between the simplicities of hierarchy and the complexities of alliance. Eisenhower's willingness to risk his position rather than yield to demands he believed threatened the coalition's effectiveness demonstrated the kind of leadership that makes democratic alliances function. Sometimes preservation of partnership requires confrontation. Sometimes unity demands the courage to draw lines and enforce consequences. The larger truth embedded in that moment resonates across all human endeavors that require cooperation among equals. Freedom itself depends on the willingness of free people to work together while respecting each other's dignity and autonomy. The alternative to voluntary cooperation is domination, where one power imposes its will on others through strength rather than consent. The alternative to messy coalition politics is authoritarian efficiency purchased at the cost of justice and respect. The choice between these paths defines not just military campaigns, but the fundamental organization of human society. In the end, Eisenhower never had to send his ultimatum to the combined chiefs. The threat alone accomplished its purpose. Montgomery backed down, the alliance held, the war reached its victorious conclusion. The snow melted from the gardens of Versailles, spring came to Europe, and the terrible machinery of conquest finally ground to a halt. The lesson remained, written not in official histories, but in the lived experience of that confrontation, that freedom survives only when those who defend it can forge unity without surrendering the very principles of dignity and partnership that make freedom worth defending. That victory means nothing if it comes through the destruction of the values that justify the struggle.